Brad Stulberg, welcome to the Mindset Advantage podcast. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time, man. A lot of respect for you.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you sent me a advanced copy of your brand new book titled Master of Change: How to Excel When Everything is Changing, Including You. And as a guy that I would consider myself to be not so good with change, especially a few years ago, this landed at a perfect time. And it's something that I've never truly read a book on how to deal with change. And I was so excited to get into it. And man, it is a phenomenal read. I don't just say that. I read a lot of books, man, but you did such a phenomenal job with this, from the storytelling to the content. It's phenomenal. I'm curious, first, to start us off, why this book and why right now, Brad?
Yeah, why this book? Just change is so ubiquitous for all of us, and me included. In the last 5.5, 6 years of my life, I've undergone countless changes that felt really significant. So the birth of my first child, moving across a country, um, stopping a job and really deciding to go at it on my own as an author, having to stop participating in a sport that had been an outsized part of my identity because of a pretty significant orthopedic condition, having major orthopedic surgery to try to fix that condition, becoming painfully estranged from certain family members, publishing my first solo book, on and on and on, having my second child. So just all of these changes happening in such a short period of time. The topic is very intimate and not only something I intellectually think about, but viscerally that I've lived. And then at the same time, we've all undergone this massive disruption, which was the COVID-19 pandemic, and in many ways still is the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think the confluence of all these changes in my personal life, plus the pandemic, really sparked my interest in this topic of change because, like you, I hadn't really done too much reading about how to navigate and adapt to change. There's all kinds of books about like leading culture change at work, but that's a very different thing than how we manage change as individuals. Um, so I decided to start exploring the idea first for myself and then for my readers, and it quickly turned into a book.
Awesome. Well, let's start with some of the content. I think the first, a great way to start is to start with either the myths or misconceptions and getting kind of that stuff out of the way. So you talk first about four ways to combat change. The first one is to people attempt to avoid it or they refuse to acknowledge it. What does that mean?
Yeah, this is just almost like pretending that change isn't happening or doesn't exist. So it's essentially burying your head in the sand or selectively paying attention to things that you want and not seeing when things are changing. Or if you do see when things are changing, kind of disregarding those altogether.
Mhm. And
So
the
this could be this, let's do an example, right?
Yeah.
Um, this could be an example of the person that just like is aging as an athlete, but completely like refuses to even acknowledge that that's happening.
I know exactly what you're talking about. The second one is actively resist the change. How is that different, Brad?
Mm. So this is you've acknowledged that the change is happening, but instead of trying to work with it, you just go into immediate defensive mode. So this is the athlete that maybe has an injury, but instead of and acknowledges it. So they're not delusional. They're not pretending they're not injured. They say that, hey, I'm injured, but instead of taking the requisite time off and to recover and to work towards rehabilitation and potentially even to adapt the way they play the game, they just refuse to do any of that. And they kind of keep doing things the way that they were in the face of this change. This is the company that says, yeah, climate change is a real thing, but we're not going to change any of our business practices. We're just going to keep going as if it doesn't exist.
Right. And then the third one is they sacrifice agency amiding chaos.
This is the person that has something happen to them that says, "Oh my gosh, like woe is me. Now that I'm injured, or now that my coach has left to go to a new team, there's nothing that I can do. I have no control in this situation. I'm just going to go wherever the tide takes me."
Similar to like a victim mindset.
That's right.
The fourth one is they try to get back to where they were.
This is the athlete that, following an injury, following a really hard defeat, following a really big success, a big win, they imagine that life is going to be the same as it was before the big event happened. and they really try to get back to that place. Even though that place is in the past, it's irrecoverable. This is also the person that moves across the country that compares their new location or switches job and compares their new job to everything they liked about their old one, and wonders why it's not the same and tries to recreate that even when that ship has long sailed.
Yeah, I imagine the person that's always thinking their best days are behind them rather than the best days could be or will be ahead of them. They're always kind of living in the past.
Yeah, or trying to recreate it. I think
Mm,
that's the other thing that's really important. Or comparing your present following a big life event to what your past was, and very similar to like denial, but just trying to get back to where you were and not acknowledging that, hey, like the environment has changed, or I've changed myself, you've changed, the team has changed, whatever it might be.
mhm. Okay, so a great place to start. So, four ways that people combat change: they attempt to avoid it, they actively resist it, they sacrifice agency amidst the chaos, and they try to get back to where they were. So, now that we got that out of the way, let's get into some of the great content that you have, man. The premise of the book is about rugged flexibility. This was such a great, I love the two words together that kind of make you go, what, how do those two go together? Talk to me about what is rugged flexibility? What does it look like? And then maybe also, what doesn't it look like?
All right, rugged flexibility. It is the core central concept in the book. And yeah, these words don't normally go together because we tend to think very this or that. So you're either rugged or you're flexible. You're either strong and robust and perhaps even a little rigid, or you're supple, you're soft, you bend without breaking. And when I went into the research and I did reporting on individuals and organizations and teams that navigate change really well, what I found is that they're not rugged or flexible, they're rugged and flexible. So, rugged flexibility is an anti fragility that allows you to endure and persist throughout all the change that is inevitable in even the most average human existence. How does this work? Well, in between the extremes of sacrificing all agency, like you said, but also over controlling or trying to fix or try to problem solve everything away, there's this middle ground where we can be really rugged and focus on what we can control and take action and try to shape the outcome as we want. But then we also need to be flexible and we need to let go of a lot too and realize the limits of fixing and problem solving and agency. And this flies in the face of this or that. You know, I'm either a superhero or a victim. I'm either rugged or flexible. It's either individual responsibility or the system. And in so many instances, nearly all of them, it's a bit of both. So rugged flexibility tries to kind of eviscerate this very dualistic linear thinking and say, hey, change is complex. And in order to navigate it, we can't be this or that. We need to be both and. We need to be both rugged and flexible.
Something you and I both agree with and live by is the power of routines. And you talk in your book about if there is a line of stability and chaos, you'd be 1 millimeter away from stability. I read that and I said to my wife, I was like, man, this is me. This is so true. And so I'm thinking about guys like you and me. What's the advice out there to be more ruggedly flexible when you love your routine and this is the way you do things and you're used to every hour doing this, but now you got a child on the way, you got these other things. What's the advice for people that you and me, where we're on the side of we crave stability, we crave routine?
I think that it comes down into how the conventional wisdom on change is so misguided because the conventional wisdom says that stability and change are polar opposites. You're either stable or you're in a process of change. This roots in the homeostasis, a scientific term that describes change as a disruption to stability and therefore a bad thing. Um, More recently, though, the research community has kind of thrown out homeostasis largely, and at least said it's very narrowly applied. And they've replaced it with a much more accurate model for change, which is called allostasis, which says that the way to be stable is by changing. So you can be stable through change. It's a double meaning, right? You're stable through change, through changing. So I think the first thing for people that really crave stability and routine is to realize that stability isn't opposed to change. Stability is complementary to change. We can be stable through change, but that requires flexibility. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'd say is to know your non negotiable rugged values. These are the things that you really believe in, that you stand for. They're portable. You can take them with you wherever you go. Things like family, things like health, creativity, kindness, wisdom, compassion, discipline, reputation, responsibility. You know, it's going to look different for everyone, but we all have these values that really make us who we are. And to me, that is our source of ruggedness. But how we apply those values, we have to be so flexible with over time as we change and as the world around us changes. So our values are like the safe kind of anchor that we can always lean on to help us navigate uncertainty, but we cannot be rigid with how we apply those values. We have to be really flexible. So health, that is very different than saying I'm a power lifter or I'm a runner. Because if you're a power lifter and then you get injured, well, you're not a power lifter. So then who are you? If you're a runner and you have, your first kid and time to train at the level you want goes away, well, then who are you? Whereas if you say what I value is health, that's my rugged value, but I can be really flexible in how I apply it. And sometimes it might look like training really hard, but other times it might look like just a daily walk. And giving yourself that flexibility is so important to navigating change over time.
You talk in that chapter two about expecting it to be hard. Is the expectancy to be hard that it's going to be hard to become flexible? What do you mean by expect it to be hard, Brad?
I mean, expect change to be hard. So the new model of change, allostasis, right? If homeostasis describes change as order, disorder, order, allostasis describes change as order, disorder, reorder. But you still got to go through disorder to get to reorder. So you're going to end up somewhere new, but it is going to take going through a period where things are uncomfortable. And uncomfortable, not always in a bad way. Yes, they're uncomfortable after a divorce or after a big failure, but they're also uncomfortable after the birth of a child or a marriage or a big win. Our nervous system doesn't really differentiate as much as we think in terms of good or bad change. It just sees change as a shock to stability, to the system. So we have to expect that any change is going to be hard. And the reason it's so important is our brain operates like a prediction machine. It's constantly trying to predict what will happen next. And if those predictions are off, we feel like crap. But if those predictions are accurate, or if when they are off, we quickly update them to match our reality, not only do we feel better, but we do better and we set ourselves up to take really productive action. So the shorthand equation that I love is that your mood at any given point in time, how you feel at any given point in time, is by and large a function of your reality minus your expectations. So if your expectations are way off from your reality, you're going to feel distress. Now, this doesn't mean you should be a Debbie Downer or always have low expectations. It simply means you should have accurate expectations. And when the environment shifts, you need to shift your expectations. So let's get really concrete and let's use an oversimplified example. We'll use two. We'll use one of an athlete and then one of a new parent. So imagine that there is an athlete that was a power lifter. I'm going to go with a sport that I know a little bit about. And they're new to the sport and they're bench pressing, they're bouncing the bar off their chest. And when they bounce the bar off their chest, they can press 315, no problem. And then they get a coach that says, actually, you kind of have to pause and hold it on your chest to do this lift technically correct. And if that person expects that they're going to be able to immediately perform like they were, they're going to be so miserable. They're going to judge themselves. They're going to say, why have I regressed? I'm no good at this, so on and so forth. But if that person quickly updates their expectation and says, hey, I'm going to have to go way down in weight because this is a new skill. This is a change to my body. It's going to take time to learn and gain that strength. They'll fare much better. And in the first example, they'll probably injure themselves too because they'll try to be a hero and they'll blow out their shoulder. Let's take the new parent that is expecting, they've heard some horror stories, but they say, hey, I think I'll be able to sleep 5 hours a night. I'm used to getting 8, but my guess is my kid will give me 5. And then you get a kid that's up every 45 minutes. This was my first son. And if you don't update your expectations for that reality, you are going to resent your kid, your partner, the universe, instead of being able to say man, I was expecting to get more sleep. I'm not. This is what's happening right now. This sucks. I don't have to like it, but this is my reality. So the more that we can quickly and accurately update our expectations to match our reality, the better we feel and the better we do.
That's awesome, man. I love it. We're expecting our first child in February, so all this stuff you're speaking right to me.
Congratulations. It's a big change.
Thank you. Yes, yeah, and that's one reason why I love this book so much. It's so fitting. So it seems so I know expectations drive behavior, drive a lot of your thinking. That makes total sense. Do you think then, I know we don't want to go all the way to the end of the spectrum of the Debbie Downer, but do you say more often than not, it's better to have lower expectations, just a better way of living is to have lower expectations? And then, hey, if it succeeds, great. Is that kind of a good way of thinking?
There's this very cliche quote, and I don't know who said it first, that the key to happiness is low expectations. But there's actually a lot of research that shows that there's some truth in that.
Sure.
So when cross-cultural researchers look at citizens of countries that score really high on various happiness markers, they tend to find that they're in the Nordic countries. And the reason for this is Nordic people tend to have really low expectations. Dark winter, maybe we're going to be invaded. And as a result, they're really happy. So I don't want to go as far as to say that it is good to have low expectations, because I think a part of what drives excellence in personal potential achievement is to expect a lot out of yourselves and to push hard. However, I think that when it comes to our emotions and how we'll feel, I think it is very important to expect that things are not always going to feel great, that we are going to face pain and suffering in times of sadness and apathy, and that we don't always need to be happy and motivated. So I think in terms of expectations for yourself and what you want to do and how you want to live, I would keep those high, but I would also expect to experience a wide range of feelings. And particularly when a big life change is coming, either good or bad, I would expect it to be hard. Because then you can be pleasantly surprised if it's not. It's like a marathon runner. The best advice to give to any distance athlete is expect the end of the race to be fucking terrible. Because then when you get there, if it is, it's no big deal. You're not surprised. You're prepared. If you get to mile 20 and it doesn't feel terrible, well, then you're in for a great day and a pleasant surprise. Whereas if you expect mile 20 to feel easy, you are going to quit when you get to mile 20 because it's going to be so hard, or you'll freak out.
That's great stuff. I think another part, I'm thinking of the people who are resistant to change, Brad. Where do these people fall? Where they're resistant because they're just uncertain about what's going to happen next. They're not really opposed to it, but hey, I'm resistant to it because I don't know what it's going to look like. This new job, this new child, it's uncertainty has got to be a big part. Where does that fit in? And what's the advice to those people? Because I think we're still in that mindset category.
That's right. So I think part of the uncertainty is to be kind to yourself and to be okay with that. Of course, uncertainty is often uncomfortable, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think a big part of the problem is so often back to expectations, we think that we should just be bulletproof. And if we feel any uncertainty, therefore something's wrong with us. When in fact, if you feel uncertainty, that's like a sign of growth. That means that you're putting yourself in the arena. You're doing something that's making you uncomfortable. There's nothing wrong with feeling apprehensive or uncertain. So some of it is just like getting rid of the self-judgment that comes with that. And then the other thing that I would say is this term tragic optimism, especially for negative changes. It was first coined by Viktor Frankl. And Frankl says that it is inevitable that we as humans will face tragedy throughout our life. And he gave 3 reasons for this. The first is that we're made of flesh and bone, and inherently we will experience some kind of physical pain. No one gets out of this life without going through at least one period of physical pain. Number 2, we're the only species that can make forward-looking plans and execute on them. And as a result, we're going to be frustrated because our plans don't always work out. And the third, and perhaps the hardest tragedy, is that everything that we love and everyone that we love changes and eventually passes away. It's all impermanent. And what Frankl says is the opposite of like the Western consumer culture positivity. He's like, these are inevitable tragedies. Why do we pretend they don't exist? Why do we try to delude ourselves from them? We need to accept them. Doesn't mean we need to like them. We can cry, we can be sad, but we need to accept that these are just here. And once we do that, in spite or maybe even because we know how hard life can be, we also can be optimistic at the same time. We don't have to be either tragic or optimistic. We can be a tragic optimist, which basically is someone that says life is hard and we're all going to go through these shitty periods, and I can trudge forward with a positive attitude nonetheless. And I can do my best to just keep showing up through that uncertainty, whether it's capital T trauma, such as like the loss of a loved one or being laid off out of nowhere or a terrible health prognosis, a career-ending injury, or if it's what I call lowercase t trauma, which is going into a new job, a fallout with a best friend, these things that hurt, but they're not like enormous earthquakes to your life. It doesn't matter. Like they're tragedies, they're going to occur, and we can still be optimistic. And I'm glad that we're focusing on mindset because like there really is no practice. I think the practice here that goes such a long way is to release from the need to always be like on point, to always have great expectations, to always be happy, and to give yourself permission to feel sad, to feel uncertain, and to wrap your mind around the fact that you can be both uncertain and confident at the same time. You can be both sad and optimistic at the same time. These things don't have to be opposites.
What I'm hearing too, Brad, is there's some sort of normalcy, trying to normalize change, recognize it, normalize it, maybe talk about it more so that it's not this big, oh my gosh, we never talk about it. You talk about tragic optimism, and in this article, I think that came out this morning, said for an athlete, when you face setbacks such as injuries or defeats, do what you can to practice tragic optimism, wise hope, and wise action. Say to yourself, like it or not, this is what is happening right now. I'm going to focus on what I can control, do the best I can, and come out on the other side.
That's it. I mean, man, who wrote that? I'm kidding. I'm better on the page than I am on the fly, but that's the name of the game. It's like an acceptance and, to your point, an expectation that like things are not always gonna be going up and to the right, and that's okay. And if we can expect that when it happens, again, we don't have to like it. This isn't about like being delusional, but we don't have to freak out either.
There's another quote in your book that I really like. It says, without change, our existence would become tedious and boring. If we are to live meaningful lives, change is simply part of the deal. I think when we talk about normalizing this, this rings true to me because it's like, look, if you're going to live in this world, in this life, change is inevitable. Growth is optional, but change is inevitable.
Yeah, that's right. There's this fascinating thought experiment that philosophers like to use, which is imagine that you were really happy at a phase of your life and you could just pause and that would be your life for the rest of eternity.
Hmm.
Most people are like, that'd be great. And then they're like, would it be great if 7 years from now that was the exact same day? Over and over, Groundhog Day, even if it was a great day, or would eventually you tire of it? Would you get sick of it? Would it become boring? So we're in this catch 22 where the hardest part of life is impermanence, and for most people, mortality. And without it, life would be so much less meaningful. It might even get tedious. So, another way that philosophers talk about this is most people, when they go through this thought experiment, are glad that at some point they'll die because it gives life meaning to know it never ends, but nobody wants to die tomorrow. And it's just one of these paradoxes that we kind of have to live in, which is part of what makes life meaningful is the fact that everything changes. And that's also part of what makes life hard. But if you play out that same day for infinity, it starts to look like a torture chamber.
Hmm. Another phenomenal point in the book, being over having. And for an athlete, you say this, adopt a being over having orientation. Make being a lifelong athlete more important than having any particular achievement. Can you break down for my listeners the differences between being and having?
For sure. So having is something that you feel like you own. So you have a 450-pound deadlift. You have a 255 marathon PR. You have a girlfriend, boyfriend, partner. You have a child. And the challenge with having is the things that we own eventually change, and therefore we become fragile. Because when those things change or are taken away, it completely disorients and uproots us. Whereas a being mindset or a being orientation puts us in relationship to those things. So it doesn't say I have a 450-pound deadlift. It says I am an athlete. I like to be an athlete. It doesn't say I have a partner. It says I am in love. It doesn't say I have a child. It says I am a parent. I'm in a relationship with my child. And when we can shift from having to being, we become less fragile to change because our relationship with the important things in our life isn't latched on to like this one component. It's much more flexible over time. I think, for athletes, the easiest way to think of this is like, do not define yourself by any specific skill or PR or PB. And I would argue for like true happiness over the long haul is don't even define yourself by any single sport. Define yourself as an athlete because you can always be an athlete. You can be an athlete at 98 in the YMCA window room, barely raising your arms and getting in and out of the chair. But if you define yourself as I have this performance, well, eventually you're not because aging comes for every single athlete. Injury comes for every single athlete. So the more that you can identify with being an athlete versus having any particular success, the happier and more fulfilled you'll be over time.
And how true, we've seen it time and time again now, where now athletes' lives are even more public than ever, that when they get out of the limelight, shit can hit the fan, man. I mean, it's suicide rates are up like crazy. They don't know what to do. They're losing money. The identity piece is so crucial. I have one more quote here from, this was How to Master Change as a Parent. Diversify your sense of self beyond simply being a parent. I get it. Parenting can be all consuming. Being a parent can be a huge part of your identity, but it should be the whole thing. Maintain other parts of your life that make you who you are. So there's a consistent theme here. It's not just parents and athletes, or it can be both. That it's everybody that there's trying to find identity outside of maybe where you spend the majority of your time. This can be tough for people, though, can't it, Brad?
Yeah, it's really tough. The metaphor that I like to use is you want your identity to be like a big house with multiple rooms. Because if you only have one room in your house and that one room floods, you're in big trouble. It's going to be really discombobulating. Whereas if you have multiple rooms in your house, you can go seek refuge in those other rooms. The story that I tell in the book to illustrate this point is that of the speed skater Niels van der Poel. He won the gold medal in the 10K and the 5K in the 2022 Winter Olympic Games, and he also set the world record. He crushed the world record by over 10 seconds. So, like, he is by far the best long course speed skater to ever set foot on this planet. And prior to the games, van der Poel felt like he was underperforming prior to the buildup to his training cycle for the games. And he identified that fear was holding him back. He was skating with a lot of fear. So he asked himself, why am I feeling all this fear? And his answer was that his entire identity was as a speed skater. He had no sense of self, no sense of self-worth, no sense of self-confidence, no sense of meaning in his life outside of being a speed skater. And that's a huge weight to carry on your shoulders every time you step into the arena. And van der Poel decided that he was going to do something pretty unheard of for a world-class athlete, which is he was going to take a normal weekend. So he says, I got friends that are in finance, that are accountants, whatever. They go out, they get beers, they go hiking, they eat pizza, they go bowling, they read books. I'm going to do that. I'm going to have other sources of meaning in my life. I'm going to diversify my sense of self. So van der Poel, from Friday night to Monday morning, lived more or less like a normal person. And again, your athlete listeners will know this. For an Olympic caliber athlete, that's crazy. He wasn't getting cupping or massage or dry needling. He wasn't sitting in Normatec recovery boots all weekend. He was just being a normal dude. And as a result, he started to diversify his sense of self. He became a community member, a friend, someone that liked books, someone that enjoyed going out to dinner. He was no longer just a speed skater. There was more to Niels van der Poel than speed skating. And in this wonderful manifesto that he wrote after he won his gold medals, he said that by devoting time and energy to developing his identity and sources of meaning outside of the speed skating oval, he was able to shed his fear of injury, fear of failure, fear of losing. And that allowed him to compete from a place of joy and love and to skate to win instead of skating not to lose. And I just think that is such a powerful story of an athlete that was able to diversify their identity, not only feel better, but perform better as a result. And I can almost assure you, because I don't know him personally, that it will still be hard for Niels van der Poel to transition out of elite sport. Like, you don't get that good and not feel some pain when it's time to hang up the skates or the shoes or the gloves, whatever it might be. But I bet that he will not suffer nearly as much as other athletes who have this like single identity. Researchers call it identity foreclosure. So that's an Olympic athlete, but it's important for the rest of us too. So people like often will say, all right, well, give me an example of a mortal. So I'm going to raise my hand and say, I'm a mortal. So I'm very dedicated to the craft of writing. It's a huge part of my identity, but it's just one room in my house. I have other very important rooms. So I have the athlete room. A big part of the reason that I still train really hard is because it gives me something else that I can make progress in other than my writing. I have the most important room, which is the family room, the dad room and the partner room, the husband room. And then I also have the community room, the neighbor room. I have the person that loves German Shepherd's room. That's a smaller one, but it's still in my house. In this way, if a book absolutely crushes, my ego won't get that big because I'll go spend time in those other rooms. And if a book totally flops, I won't spiral into despair because I'll go spend time in those other rooms. And my hope is that when my kids move out of the house one day, go off to school, hopefully, even though my heart will be broken, I'll double down on my pursuits as an athlete in my career. So you can see how over time you can emphasize and de-emphasize different parts of your identity, and it really makes you so much more rugged and flexible in the face of change. This is my favorite part of the book. I get stoked talking about this because it's so practical. And like, at least for me, when I came across this research, it's like, of course, but then you look out in the world and you see how many people fall for this trap. And like you said, it's the athlete in retirement, it's the entrepreneur in retirement, it's the creative who their whole identity is the outcome of their work and they ride this crazy roller coaster of highs and low. It's the parent who, when their kids leave the house, they find that they don't really even know their partner, so they get a divorce and they feel empty. I mean, we do this so often, and not for any reason other than it's just a default pattern that people fall into. But there's an alternative way.
I think some of it falls back into just the common, small talk. Hey, what's your name and what do you do? And we say this one answer of I am a writer, I am an athlete, and we kind of define ourselves into one role. Another metaphor that I think displays it so well in your book, you say, like water, a fluid sense of self can go in and fill any space, but it can also flow out of that space when necessary, changing shape without changing form. So I see it that way too, of like, we got these different cups and the water's moving in and out, and one cup can be full while others low, but depending on your season of life, things are going to change constantly.
That's it. And I've been really fortunate to get to spend a lot of time with truly world-class performers because, let me give you the context. The common retort, and I'm just going to preempt it because some listeners might have it, is like, that's great, but, Niels van der Poel is only one story. Like, don't you have to be obsessed to be great? And there are two broad buckets of people that achieve greatness. One, they only have one element of their identity, and it's the thing they do. And these people are great. They can be great at that thing. They also tend to be miserable assholes. There are other people who are equally as good at what they do, who do diversify, who do have other sources of meaning in their life, and they tend to be much more happy, fulfilled, and more pleasant people to be around. So there are these two paths. And the research shows, not just me, but they have an equal probability of like ending in success, but only one path has a probability of ending in catastrophic failure, and that is the singular identity. So I can give you three examples from three different domains
Please do.
to make this really clear. Lance Armstrong, entire identity was as a cyclist. When he wasn't performing at his best, what's he going to do? Like, your whole identity is at stake. So he doped, he cheated, he brought a lot of people down with him. Elizabeth Holmes, Theranos, her whole identity was as a successful entrepreneur. What happened when her company ran up against a wall? She cheated. She engaged in fraud. Jeff Skilling, CEO of Enron, his entire identity was as the executive Enron. What happened when their quarterly report wasn't good? He cheated. He engaged in fraud. So we tend to have these spectacular blowups when one thing becomes all that we have, because then when that thing changes, we do anything, even if it means engaging in unethical behavior, to save it. Whereas if we can have these other rooms, we can really weather those storms and still find meaning in our life.
I think another athlete that fits in this, you talk about Roger Federer. Why don't you tell that story? That's a great story.
Yeah, I love Roger Federer. Roger Federer, if you've been living under a rock for the last 30 years, he's one of the best tennis players to ever play the game. But he's also really stands out because the longevity of his career. So Federer was dominant into his late 30s. And Federer really changed tennis. Now players think they can have older careers. But before Federer, like, you would peak in your late 20s, maybe if you're lucky, 31, 32 in tennis. And Federer was like that. So he dominated the sport, and then he hit 33. And again, pre-Roger Federer times, you're a dinosaur at 33. And his performance really started to tank. He suffered a slew of injuries, and he was forced to drop out of so many tournaments that in the past he would have won with his eyes closed. And a lot of spectators and commentators and even his fellow competitors said, age is finally catching up to Roger. And between 33 and 36, Federer didn't really perform well. But what he was doing during that time period is he was evolving. He was being very flexible. He was learning a new one hand backhand that would slow down the ball. He was learning how to play at the net better so that he could shorten points. He shifted his racket, which is like sacrilegious. This, he gave up the racket that he had used for the last 2 decades to make him the best in the world for a brand new racket that younger kids were using. Embrace the new technology of the racket. So 36 and a half, Federer makes these adjustments to his game. What happens? He wins 2 Grand Slam tournaments, 2 majors. He's ranked number 2 in the world. He has the best winning percentage of his career, one of the best seasons of his career. And I think he's another really profound example of rugged flexibility. What was rugged about Federer? His values. Federer was a tennis player. He was an athlete. He valued competition and he valued excellence. How he applied those values shifted. He didn't value a powerful 2-handed backhand. He didn't value playing at the baseline. He didn't value his old racket. So because he identified with these rugged values that were so much more broader, they were being terms, not having terms, he was able to be really flexible in how he practiced them, which is what allowed him to evolve and to continue to dominate the sport in an age when so many people would be watching from the couch.
So what I'm hearing is that rugged flexibility and having a proper identity has a very direct correlate with your longevity, how long you're able to do things, whether it's at a high level in sport or, you know what, Brad, I'm having a lot of conversations about your book recently, and I'm surrounded by a lot of teachers. My mom's a teacher, and some people at the gym are teachers, and feedback I hear is that older teachers are very resistant to change. It's always the old teacher, right? But the new teachers, they're all in with the new times, and they're all down to do this new changing stuff. But as you get older in your career, they become more resistant to it. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that as far as like the deeper you get into your career, you get a little bit more stubborn and this is my way and this is the way I want to do it from a teacher aspect, or maybe it's a coach.
I think that it depends on the situation. And we do, as we get older, we do tend to get a little bit more rigid. I think the best way around that is just to surround yourself with young people. So as I get older, I always, people say don't be the smartest person in the room. And I think that's true, but you never want to be the oldest person in the room either.
Touche.
And I think surrounding yourself with young people, even if you don't always agree with them, it helps keep you young and open-minded. However, I think that there's a point where some people are really late in their career and they might just say it's not worth the effort to change. That's okay. Like that's a choice that they're making, but it doesn't have to be the default choice.
Got it. I want to dive a little bit deeper into core values, Brad, because one of the things I do as a mental performance coach is I have 7 skills to acquire an elite mindset. And the first skill is a curiosity mindset. Such a big believer in staying curious and asking yourself better questions. And the first questions I want my athletes to get to know for themselves is, what is your mission? What is your vision? And what are your principles? It's your MVP process. And so I think
Love
that
it.
some of the stuff really aligns together. So for an athlete, you have this written down. I think this is great. I'd love for you to expand on it. You said, know your core values and apply them to sport. Remember, there is a difference between the finite game, winning and losing on any given day, and the infinite game, growing as a human being through sport. Both matter, but working through the former is a lot easier when you keep the perspective of the latter. Dude, we could do a whole book and a whole podcast on this alone, but we got to touch on this, man. Why is this so important? What does it look like? Go ahead. The floor is yours.
It's kind of back to that Federer example. Like, what's the point of all this? If the point is just to like win a medal or hit a PR, well, I got bad news for you. You're going to be really disappointed whether you do it or you don't. Because if you do it, it's like, then what? No one gets better forever. Eventually we all hit our peak, especially as athletes. Like, aging is a thing. Even with the greatest technology, you can dope to the gills. Eventually you're going to turn 75. And I don't care how much, TRT you're on, like your performance is going to go down, right? And for many of us that don't want to engage in that, it goes down earlier. So even if you succeed, you better get used to a performance decline. And if you fail, it sucks. But if you can zoom out and just say, like, what am I doing here? I want to be a better human being. I want to learn about discipline. I want to learn how to face my fears. I want to be vulnerable. I want to do something real in the world. I want to have community in the gym. I want to be healthy for my family. That stuff, that lasts forever. Like, that is the infinite game. And along the way, you'll have wins and losses. And like you read that quote from the book, like they're still going to hurt or they're still going to be great, but you can zoom out and gain that perspective. Like, what are you really trying to do here? So I think sport is a venue to be a better human being. And I think if you define sport that way and you keep that perspective, you'll have a better relationship with sport over a longer period of time. Then you have to choose, not you, you listener, the global you have to choose, well, what does it mean to be a better human being? Like, what are you trying to get out of sport? But I think if sport is an end in and of itself, it makes you a little bit fragile because like then you're on that performance emotional roller coaster.
Mhm. One of my favorite people, Dr. Jim Layers, a sports psychologist, wrote several books. He's been on the show. He talked his quote that just always rings in my head is the most important part of the chase is who you become along the way. So it's not what happens at the end, but we all talk about this chase, right? We're all chasing something. But the biggest lesson is who are you becoming along the way? And sport is that. It's just a chase. We're just chasing different things. Who are you becoming along the way? It's a huge question for a lot of high school kids because I work with a lot of high school athletes. They've never been asked this stuff before. Brad's like, holy crap, man, this is some big question. I'd be curious for a guy like you. How would you ask this question? How would you get high school athletes to start to resonate and write down core values? What would your process look like?
For a high schooler in particular,
Let's go high school or college athlete.
yeah, I would start by asking them to come up with people that they admire. And then I would ask them, well, what do you admire about these people? And that's a really good inroad to values that you might hold. I would also ask them, hey, imagine you're like 45 years down the road. Look back at current you, like older, wiser you. What would older, wiser you be proud of? That's a good way to get into values. Another way that is somewhat popular, and I think for good reason, it's effective, is to like imagine that you died and like what's on your tombstone. That's your values. Those are the things you value. And then for the athlete, the question is, all right, how can you get that out of sport? How can you practice those values and develop those values and to mature into those values in sport? And then the other thing I think, especially in today's day and age, that's really important about sport, and it's a huge benefit, I think, for so many people, and certainly me personally, I can only speak to my personal experience, is it's just a real thing in the world. Like it keeps you down to earth. As our world increasingly gets in like new technologies, all the changes, some good, some bad, some neutral. Uh, Zooms, email, follower counts, all this subjective stuff, what people think of you, what people think of your work. The barbell doesn't think a thing of you. The time on the stopwatch or at the back end of the pool doesn't care. It's not interested in your politics. It's not interested in office politics. It is just concrete. It is objective. And I think, in my world of like writing in words and more intellectual, one of the best benefits of sports is like it keeps me like it's literally in my case, because I lift, it's like a gravitational force. Like it reminds me that like, man, like you got to do something real in the world, touch grass. The barbell doesn't care. And I'm talking predominantly strength because I'm a strength athlete, but if you're a runner, the stopwatch doesn't care. If you're a swimmer, it doesn't care. So there's something really real about sport. And then there's also something in a time when there's so much polarization that sport can just help like bring to bear our common humanity. Um, and I think that, when you are engaging in pursuing an athletic goal, whether it's on a team or it's an individual goal, but you're training with other people, even if you're not training with them formally, you just show up to the same gym. There's just something about pushing your body in that very objective way that is so objective and humanizing. So I think that for everyone, a big benefit of being a lifelong athlete are those two things. Like you're doing something real in the world, which is really humbling, and you're hopefully connecting with people on a very human level that you wouldn't otherwise necessarily connect with.
In this chapter about identity, you also talk about develop rugged and flexible boundaries. Can you elaborate on the boundary piece?
Yeah, so the boundaries I think really are like the core values. You read that quote about the river and the water flowing in and around and through. And I think like one way to very poetically think about identity is it's like a river. It's like this process of becoming. And there's this famous Heraclitus quote, you can't step into the same river twice. And that's true of us. Like we're never the same person as we were. We're always changing. But when you look at a river, it's there. Like you can say that's a river. I can say that's DJ. So there's also like some boundary to it. There's some constraint. In our own life, I think those boundaries are our core values. Like that's the stuff that kind of guides our path and guides our change. So we don't know where we're going to end up, but every time we face uncertainty, every time we face change, if we can ask ourselves, what are my core values and how would I act on them in this moment? It will guide us exactly to where we need to go.
I love it. And if you don't take the time to do this, this is what I try to teach with my athletes. If you don't take the time to do this, especially for the coaches, if you don't take the time to come up with your values, what's going to happen is you're probably going to start living somebody else's values. And you probably don't know your own definition of success because you're living somebody else's definition of success. So these boundaries create alignment for you to live like the person you want to live. Would you agree with that?
Oh, 100%. Like, you got to know what game you're playing. And I think they're like your internal scoreboard, and it's really the most important one because yeah, otherwise you're gonna be like a magnet that's just gonna get attached to whatever bright and shiny object is in your current field.
Right. Your internal scoreboard. I like that. I might steal that from you. Okay. So we have the mindset piece, we have the identity piece. The last one here is the rugged and flexible actions. And in chapter 5, you talk about respond, not react. And I like to use the phrase get curious, not furious. I think that we agree on some of this. So talk to me about respond, not react. And then if we're going to talk about action, let's give some applicable action items. How do you do this? What does it look like?
All right, so um, we talked about the mindset, we talked about the identity a bit. Now you're in the moment, and your expectations aren't met. A change happens. So what are you going to do? Reacting is very hot. It's emotionally driven. It's rash. It's immediate. There's a time for it. You're running a 400 and you're hanging onto someone's shoulder and they break. You want to react. You want to stay on that person's shoulder. You're playing cornerback and you hear ball, ball, ball. You want to immediately react. So there's a time and a place for reacting. But oftentimes we actually want to respond. We want to slow things down. We want to be more thoughtful. We want to be discerning. This is particularly when we're making life decisions. When we're at a juncture where we face a big change in our life and the path forward is unclear, we don't want to be on autopilot because often we're not our best self when we're on autopilot. So I've come up with this framework of 2Ps versus 4Ps. So 2Ps is what we do when we react. We panic and we pummel ahead. 4Ps is how we respond. We pause, we process what's happening, we make a plan, and only then do we proceed. And the best way to pause and to process is exactly what you said. It's by getting curious about your experience and naming your emotions. So all kinds of science shows that when we can get curious and instead of just going on autopilot, you can say, like, how am I feeling? Like, what is that? Is it overwhelm? Is it excitement? Is it nerves? And it becomes really interesting because when you do this enough, you realize that excitement, nervousness, restlessness, anxiety, they all feel more or less the same. So like you get really curious about what you're feeling and you name it. And just the act of doing that, it creates space. So you've already taken yourself out of a reactionary mode and put yourself in a responsive mode. And then you can process what you're feeling. You can process the situation. And like now you're 95% of the way there, right? Because you've turned off that automatic response. And then you can make a plan. You can say, hey, given what's happening, what are my skills, capabilities, and resources? What can I control versus what can't I? And how can I make sense out of this? And only then do you proceed, which is so different than just snapping immediately.
Mm, I love that. I find myself when I'm coaching athletes on the mental game, one of the major key focuses and lessons for these kids to understand is what's inside of your control and outside of your control. Comes from Stoicism. It is, if you've never heard of this, if you're a kid out there listening, you've never heard, this is life changing. Draw a line down the middle of a piece of paper and in your sport, write what's inside of your control and outside of your control. Get really clear on those two things. That alone is a simple drill that can be life changing for kids. I've seen it firsthand. So for me, Brad, when this stuff happens and adversity hits, I go pause, process, plan, and proceed. One of the first things I want to do after pause is ask myself, can I control this or can't I control this? And that gives me so much clarity. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if the answer is no, then this is going to sound so easy, but doing it is so hard. You don't want to worry about it. Like, let it go. Stop checking your ranking on the local tennis circuit. You checking your ranking doesn't change anything about your game. If you're injured, like you calling your PT 6 times a day for updates doesn't change anything about your rehabilitation process. I think that's a trap that a lot of young athletes fall into because it's so easy now because of the internet to like check, where am I ranked? What are my numbers? How do they compare to other recruits? What's my stat line compared to other recruits? But you can't control any of that. You can only control the work that you're putting in. So yeah, you don't want to waste time on what you can't control. You want to really squarely focus on what you can.
I think we live also in a very reactive world. Things are very quick to text. People want to quick email back. You slide through TikTok and everything's quick. It's a very reactive type of world. I think we live in. I think that's a safe way to kind of categorize it. Where it's a little more rare to have the respond, the wait a second. Hey, let me get back to you in a day. That's becoming more and more rare, isn't it? Than it perhaps used to be.
It is, and I write that one of the best ways to be responsive is to try to surround yourself like in a responsive environment. So what does that mean? Probably less time on social media, more time reading books, less time doing 9 things while listening to a podcast, more time just listening, maybe listening on a drive or a walk. Um, People that are really reactionary in your life, well, unless you're married to them, which is its own issue, like maybe don't spend as much time with them. Try to surround yourself with thoughtful, responsive people, thoughtful, responsive content, and try not to multitask. And then you become a more responsive person because you're right. The 4 Ps, it's a hell of a framework, but if you're constantly swimming in reactionary waters, it's very hard just to turn it on like a switch. Whereas if you can cultivate a more responsive, thoughtful, discerning environment, it gets a lot easier to be a more thoughtful, discerning, responsive person.
Totally. And that might mean with a significant other or with a kid or with one of your athletes, it might mean first saying, I need a minute. I need a second. Give me a minute before you exert into that furious mode, right? It's just being okay, Brad, with saying that first. Just give me 1 minute before I respond to this, or 10, or a day.
That's right. And then naming your emotion. I'm feeling really frustrated. I need a minute. I'm feeling really overwhelmed. I need a minute. I'm feeling really excited. I'm worried I'm going to move too fast. I need a minute. I need a day, like you said. I need a week. That's fine. There's interesting parenting research that show our kids actually really value that because what
Mm,
we're role modeling to them is that we're there for them. We're not running away. We're not neglecting them, but we're also really thoughtful. We're not snapping. So one of the best things you can do when your kid is melting down is just to sit there with them and say, I understand you're feeling frustrated. I'm feeling frustrated too, but we're not going to do anything about this. We're not going to escalate. It's just going to be a safe space. I'm going to keep you safe and let you be frustrated, and I can be frustrated with you. And we're going to wait until this cools down because, most fires, like emotional fires, cool down on their own. It's only when we pour kerosene on them by snapping and reacting that they get worse.
mm. Love the analogy. Let's close down with in the last part of your book, you have some phenomenal questions for the readers, and there's 5 of them. Maybe we go through 2 or 3, Brad. What are 2 or 3 of your favorite questions to embrace change and develop that rugged flexibility? Do you have 2 or 3 favorites that we can close with?
Yeah, let's do it. Um, I want to make sure that I'm quoting accurately, so I'm actually pulling out the book. I know I wrote it, but I don't want to misquote myself here. I think the first is in what parts of your life are you holding on to unrealistic expectations? We talked a lot about how like our consciousness is really a function of our expectations. And if we don't update those, we tend to run into walls of our own making. I think another is, are there elements of your identity to which you cling to too tightly?
Mm,
If you're a coach, how are you working with your athletes to teach them the value of hard work and goal pursuit and even obsession, while at the same time teaching them that they've got to have multiple rooms in their identity home? And then the last thing I think you'll say is how can you be rugged and flexible? Like, what are your core values? And then how can you flexibly apply them when change comes your way? So those would be my favorite 3 reflection points.
That's great stuff, Brad. This is a lot of fun, man. I really enjoy your content. I look up to you in many different ways, man. You're doing some phenomenal things. So thanks for taking the time. For my listeners out there, the new book comes out today, Master of Change: How to Excel When Everything is Changing, Including You. Where can they get the book, and how else can we support you, Brad?
Thanks. I really appreciate the kind words, and I enjoyed this conversation very much too. The book is available wherever books are sold. You can get it from Amazon, Barnes and Noble, your local bookseller. It's available in all formats: hard copy, ebook, audio. And the best way to support my work is to read the book, to share it, to share this conversation, to wrestle with these topics. I love writing. As I said earlier, I view myself as a craftsperson. Writing is my craft. But I also see my primary job is to introduce these ideas into your community, your local community, so you can discuss them, you can wrestle with them, you can make them your own. So read the book, share the book, discuss the book.
And for those of you that are Instagram, Brad, I truly believe you have the best Instagram page there is out there, man. It's just full of wisdom every single day. What's your handle? How can people follow you? And what can they expect by following you on that platform as well?
My Instagram handle is at Brad Stulberg, and I really appreciate you saying that. I take an unconventional approach to Instagram. I don't post very many pictures. I post a lot of words because I'm a writer. I'm not a physical therapist. So, what you can find on my Instagram are a couple times a week, just really trying to unpack interesting concepts and to do my best internet writing. Doesn't compare to my book writing, but it's a close second.
Brad, this is a joy and a pleasure, man. Thanks for your time.
Appreciate you, DJ.